Welcome to the 2-month review. This is Chad Post. I'm here with Lytton Smith.
Hi.
And this week we're joined by Kári Tulinius, who is a poet, a translator yourself, right? Do you translate too? You're a poet and novelist from Iceland. Yeah. I know that you've done some translation stuff too. You've been published. You have a novel. You have poetry chapbooks. You've edited poetry chapbooks, and you're joining us this week to talk about Tómas Jónsson Bestseller by Gudbjörg Bergson, which we've been working our way through slowly but surely. We are up to the penultimate sections that we're talking about. We're going to be talking about the 14th, 15th, and 16th books, which are pages 306 through 360. And then next week, we'll finish it off and finish the whole book. So we're almost through Tómas Jónsson. But before we get into the book itself, Kári, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your work, about Iceland, about how things are going, all that kind of stuff. And I guess maybe the best place to start is that you have a new novel that came out just this past spring, or winter, February 2017, that is translated, I guess, as Of a Mother's Mind.
Yeah, it's the Icelandic word móðurhugur is sort of, I mean, it's a difficult word to translate. It sort of means it means mother's mind, but it's also sort of that kind of goodwill that a mother has for a child, and sort of the sort of thing that the sort of child sort of carries with it, kind of, and so it's a very sort of loaded term in Icelandic. And I found out actually that you can translate it into, I split my time between Iceland and Finland, and I found that you can translate it into Finnish very easily, but no other language that I've found. So, you know.
It's a constant problem for me, Kári. My life is filled with things that only work in Finnish.
I should also mention that you don't write a column anymore for the Grapevine, do you?
No, I stopped in 2015. I think my last column came out in January 2016. I basically, in summer of 2015, I had a son, and that meant that I had to sort of focus my efforts more sort of I had to sort of on fewer sort of things, and that column was one of the things that I just had to let go.
You can find it for anyone who's listening on the Reykjavik Grapevine is really the English language alt weekly, essentially, with various information about Iceland, about events, about everything. It's really fantastic. It's a great paper to have when you're there, and all of Kári's articles are online, and they're all set up as this like general questions, right? It's like, what's this I keep hearing about rising inequality in Iceland? Or, so what's this literary scandal I keep hearing about? So what's this letter to the European Union I keep hearing about? Which is a fantastic way to frame like a column like that.
Yeah, it was basically sort of, we took kind of a thing that's sort of me and the editor, Anna Anderson, who's now an editor of, I think it's called Tribeca magazine or something. Tribeza. It's a magazine down in Austin, Texas.
Oh,
she was the editor. She's an Icelander who grew up in the U.S. And she and I would sort of go back and forth about what sort of topics were kind of in the news, and then I would write a column sort of kind of explaining it, and trying to put a sort of funny spin on it if possible. And yeah, and it was fun. It was like also kind of a fun sort of exercise because there would be kind of like dialogues, sort of mock dialogues, sort of question and answer session, and it was funny because in my the book that just came out, there's one of the characters gets sort of called in for an interview rather than an interrogation by the FBI, and having sort of written all these dialogues that sort of flowed very easily, and it was kind of nice to find that sort of these things that I'd been doing kind of in a completely different sphere sort of transferred over to sort of something else.
That's really spectacular. So one other thing, you used to you lived in the United States for a time too, correct?
Yeah, I lived. It was spread out over a decade, but I lived for 7 years in the U.S., mostly in Providence. And actually worked at a Brown bookstore for a few months.
Wow. That's fantastic. That ties into the other podcast that we do, the 3% podcast with Tom opening his bookstore in Providence.
Yeah, actually, I have a self-interested question. Do you know if that's opening up soon?
I don't. I think the goal is to have it open soon, but I don't know what the current status is.
Because in the novel actually that I wrote is set in Providence, or like the first section of it, and I needed and it's set actually during the sort of fall of 2017.
Oh wow!
And I needed a bookstore that would have like a random French novel. And then when I heard that Tom Roberge was opening up a bookstore, I was like, oh, his bookstore will have it. So, and at that point, it was like opening up soon. And then I was writing it like last year. So I'm hoping that it'll open up before, I think it's in October 12th when the character buys the book.
And he references Riff Raff specifically, or just a bookstore?
Yeah, Riff Raff.
Oh my God, that's fantastic. Does Tom know this?
I doubt it.
That's
unless some Icelandic reader has let him know.
I doubt it.
So what we're saying, this may be the first time that a novel has named a bookstore before the bookstore has actually ever come into existence. Right? Like, can any other listeners to the podcast name a book that has named a place that then existed after the book was published? That's a great literary pop quiz.
That is fantastic. Wow, I love that. I love that story. I'm gonna have to tell him. Like, I kind of should do it while we're recording a podcast and just spring it at him, but I'm not sure I can wait that long. That's too good. That's too good. So yeah. So I'm not sure if there's anything else to add about that, except that you were one of the people in my memory. Although maybe I sort of invented this, but when we first started looking into Tómas Jónsson bestseller when it was first recommended, I asked you if you thought it was something that we should publish, and I think at that time you had not read it fully. Or knew of it, read part of it, and then I think there's an email in which you're like, "Yeah, you guys probably should do this," which was one of the parts where you're like, "Yes." Then in fact, we will do it. We will publish this book.
Yeah, it's an absolute classic, and it's sort of this thing like where my father is a huge fan of my father is a huge fan of GoodReads Group, so he was kind of a little bit. He was almost like too present in my life for me to read him when I was sort of younger. But then it was I decided to go read him, like sort of I decided this was going to be my project this year, was to start reading GoodReads Group. And it was funny, it was just like a couple of days after I'd started Tómas Jónsson, when you sent me an email asking me to be asking if there was interest in being on the podcast.
Perfect timing.
Yeah.
So what did you suggested when we were talking about this beforehand that you might be able to give a good kind of take on, especially given that your father's interest in him as a writer and in this book, I assume, a good take on like Iceland and Icelanders' reaction to this novel and to Bergson overall. What was the general reaction to this? I know we've talked about it a bit, but I'd be curious to hear your perspective as to how people react to this book.
It is actually quite interesting. I went back to like read sort of book reviews from the time and sort of other sort of stuff about it. And one thing I found out is that it was received extremely well.
Oh,
like the book reviews, like, you know, there were a couple of sort of like skeptical ones, but in general, they were absolutely kind of in love with it. Almost, it was really quite striking, and to sort of, and like there was at the time the main literary prize was this prize given out by book critics, and when they voted to on what book of the year should get the prize, that book, Tómas Jónsson and another book were ended up equal in the voting, and it was like some really weird and complicated system that I didn't want to get in. Like, I didn't bother to like learn about it, but they ended up with like 350 points each, and like the next book was like 100 points or something like that. And then they had to run the vote again with just the two books. And then this other book of poetry won by a poet called Snorri Hjartarson. And it's sort of like, Snorri Hjartarson is like a poet that is like, it's completely respectable to lose to him. He went on to win the sort of Nordic Council Prize which is sort of the big kind of Nordic prize.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it was like really well received. And actually, one thing that I found this sort of funny passage where this guy was writing a few years later, complaining or talking about sort of new books and what kids were reading, and he talked about how he was talking with these, I guess, 17 and 18-year-olds, sort of high school age kids, and the only sort of recent book that they had read, or many of them had read, was Tómas Jónsson.
Wow.
So it was sort of the book that, I mean, because it's Iceland's Ulysses, but on the other hand, it was also kind of, because this is coming out in the 60s, this was also in a way like Iceland sort of on the road. It was sort of the book that was sort of embraced by the sort of youth in the 60s and the 70s.
Wow, it does kind of surprise me though too, because it's such a complicated book. Like I'm used to, like, if there's something gets embraced by the youth or by the general critics, it's going to be something that's like straightforward, easy to digest. And this book is anything but that at times.
Yeah, but it's pretty funny.
Yeah, it is. This is very true.
You can forgive a lot of someone who makes you laugh.
Yeah, that is very true too. It does make a big difference. But you also said this book has been reissued a bunch of times, as we've talked about too.
Yeah, it's been reissued twice, in 87 and then in 2012. And actually, in the intro to the 1987 edition, which is the one I read, he talks about that he didn't allow it to be reprinted, which just sort of explains something which was kind of puzzling, because when I was reading sort of old magazine articles about it, people were always talking about how it had sold out immediately, but then it wasn't printed again. But he seems to have not wanted. He says in the intro that he thought of it as a book that only had something to say to the generation that Tómas Jónsson sort of represents, and that it wasn't really meant for anyone else.
This is literally.
Sorry. It's something that we've talked actually a lot about on the book, is like the strangeness, like for me as a translator, but I think for our readers and listeners on the podcast, that some of it seems to be this sort of weirdly prescient or present stuff that you could apply to like America today, and maybe even conversations between America and Russia. And I actually heard Eddie Izzard, the comedian Eddie Izzard, sort of quipping that people seem to want to live in the 1930s again, which of course is a terrible idea. And, Eddie Izzard's sort of very funny, but it's a very sad thing that he's saying that. But so there's this sense in which somehow like the book's time has come again, and maybe even in another language.
Yeah. And actually I don't know when this will go out, but when this is recorded, there's just been this sort of huge scandal in Iceland that sort of brought down the government, which it felt like reading and thinking about Tómas Jónsson during that time was very sort of a little bit too appropriate, because it was basically a combination of sort of inept bureaucracy, sort of weird kind of weird secrecy, and then just sort of very base human urges and crime sort of combined together to bring down the sort of government. And it's sort of too complicated to explain in sort of detail, but basically there's this sort of system in Iceland where if you want to say run for office or become a lawyer, you have committed a sort of serious felony, you have to get what's called you have to basically have your honor restored. It's not a pardon, and it's not an expunging of criminal records, but it's a way to sort of say that the government thinks you're fit for these sort of kind of things, like say being a lawyer or being a member of parliament or being a priest, sort of it's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And these it came up. It came up that these that sort of these pedophiles or this one pedophile and one man who had like committed, in some ways much more serious, and committed like multiple statutory rapes.
Wow.
And was kind of and both of them had their sort of honor restored, and then it became this sort of big sort of rigmarole where the government was hiding who had sort of written these sort of letters of recommendation, which are these things that you need to have your honor restored. And then it came out finally that the prime minister's father had written one letter of recommendation for this, for one of the people one of those sort of two men who had their honor restored. And it brought down the government. And it was just this very kind of, it felt like a story from Tómas Jónsson somehow.
Yeah.
It really is, and it's. I mean, all of this. I mean, the government was dissolved on Monday, the 16th. This, this. I guess it's like the 5th of October as people are listening to this. So, and elections aren't, I think, until the end of October. But, it has to do with this sense of like where honor comes from and how you restore your honor and who gets to do that. And that's really how, like, chapter 14, which we're talking about on this podcast, is really all about that question, and the way that chapter ends with this, these sort of really graphic sort of thinking through of, like, was it a rape and what happened? And, like, we're actually sort of getting, like, there's no scene of ejaculation earlier in the book when that happens, and now we get that here. But they've got, like, this is all taking place in a court of law with judges, and so it feels like this question of Icelandic honor is is all through Tómas Jónsson and obviously still so important to Icelandic society.
Yeah, and you're talking about it's on, I think, page 344 and 345. Where he's talking about these sort of investigation, and these two police women come and lock him up.
Yep.
Yeah. And yeah, that's actually I went and read that. It's actually, that's one of the chapters that's changed between versions, which I think I'll get into. But it's one of those things where, like, the Icelandic is sort of playing with language. Which, on one way, it's like he's both sort of presenting evidence to exonerate himself, but at the same time, it's worded in such a way that it's not. It's like it's also possible to see it as a confession. Mm-hmm. So it's let me just sort of get the open the book to
Kári's doing that. I think this is one of the challenges of the, being a translator, is that you never want your readers to be confused by something you've translated. But this book, time and again, it's not necessarily confusion, but it's asking the reader to sort of have two things in their mind at the same time, and it's really hard to get that across without, at least risking confusion.
Yeah, I think it's in the sentence in the English translation. It's in page 345, it goes, in the investigation now, I would innocently ask what relevance that has, but in a dream, of course, I would be equally guilty after as before. And it's sort of, what he's sort of saying is that he's sort of both sort of like saying, kind of on the face of it, that if it was properly investigated, he would be found innocent, and that it was only something that happened in a dream. But it's also like he's also kind of saying, like, I was sort of thinking about this, is that I sort of think that, like, because if you sort of put it together with all the other things that are sort of going on, you sort of think that you sort of wonder if he tried to rape this girl in the laundry room, and that he just couldn't get it up. And that's sort of because then he goes into this detail about this talcum powder that he rubs on his testicles, and he's saying that it would only be like only a very little bit would be found on the girl, and I'm sort of like it's like it's sort of I sort of the more I think about it, the more I think that because in this is sort of this sort of whole chapter is also like there's so much misogyny in it. Yeah. That's sort of just like spewing forth from Tómas, that it's that I'm sort of wondering like if the guilt that he has isn't that he committed rape, but that he couldn't get it up enough to commit rape. And it's like, really, he's like, it's sort of this kind of, because it's weird to read this book, because sometimes, you feel kind of quite sympathetic to this sort of frail old man. But on the other hand, he's awful. He's like a really kind of hideous, almost kind of like evil person. And it's weird. It's kind of, and it's sort of interesting also, like, and then, it's, it's kind of, he's, in kind of that way, sometimes it kind of reminds me a little bit of like Jean Genet in, like Funeral Rites, which, where basically Jean Genet or the narrator is asking the sort of beseeching the reader to have sympathy for a collaborator with the Nazis. And it's that kind of sort of, it's sort of like, you're really sort of asked to go into the sort of deep dark cellar under the rubble too.
I'm going to talk about the rubble things in a second, because there's those two stories which are pretty interesting and fun to look at. But there is also, so he has the misogyny and the sort of crazy dark side, and then there's the things like on 342 where it's like, I do not want to deny the fact that sometimes I even consider my desire to become a fleshly woman for a short time, maybe just once or twice a day. Ideally, I would have been a kind of gender tuner with a gender switch beneath my belly or in a secret belt around my navel. And then he has this part that's like not quite accurate, but like kind of funny and like a little bit weird later on that page, where it says, on the men's market, there is too much supply and fierce competition, but there's an open way to fame and fortune for a gifted, talented woman. People may doubt my talents and abilities as a man, but were they in the cylinder of a woman's body, they would probably say, she is singular. The requirements for a woman are less stringent. Generally, it is said, he is lazy for a man. He is ugly for a man. As a woman, he would have probably been considered hardworking and handsome. I do not know, but there's no doubt that I often consider becoming a woman.
Yeah. And I think this is where Kári sort of, hitting sort of on the nose, the fact that this is like, probably the most misogynistic and awful chapter in the book. And again, I can't not see in front of me Donald Trump looming over Hillary Clinton in those presidential debates at this moment, because there is this sense where like he believes himself to be able to empathize with what it might mean to move through the world in a woman's body, and therefore is almost pretending or thinking himself to be like the opposite of misogynistic. But it's precisely that pretending or thinking himself as a woman is making him more misogynistic and less aware.
Yeah, this is a pretty dark chapter. And then there's the two stories of the people being buried, which have like whole other significances in some ways, where the first one is the people in Poland that get buried alive during go down to the shelter and stay underground and are eventually rescued years after World War II, and they accidentally break into this like underground bomb shelter, and these people are living in there, and they're like, oh, they don't even speak nonsense language, and they realize that's actually just Polish from a few years ago, and they're like, wow, they get to come out to the light, and it's like almost like living outside in the real world is worse, because they were better off staying in their shelter where they had there are lots of food. Although there's some question as to how they ate and how they could have survived that. But nowadays in Poland, post-World War II, everything sucks and no one has any food and everything's pretty poor and run down. And then there's a parallel story, which is much darker and much more fucked up, in which there's a bomb that collapses a house and a man and woman are trapped, and they end up having a baby to commit infanticide so that they can eat the baby to survive. And there's like all these questions of what do you do to survive? That's really, this is a very, very, very dark, this is the darkest part of this book, I think, to me.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to add to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really felt that as I was sort of reading that bit where they sort of go, where the part that's in Germany, but he's sort of the narrator, like Tómas Jónsson himself sort of points out that this story is like unbelievable. The part where I can't remember, he's a sort of a bourgeois sort of German who gets buried under the rubble when he's visiting a prostitute.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And there's this whole bit where he returns to it where when he heard the story like Hamburg was situated on the wrong river, and there's this sort of kind of, so he sort of flags it up as this kind of unbelievable story, and then tells it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something I sort of wondered, because when I was now reading it again, because I read the book in Icelandic, and then I read that section again in English, and it was like I really started to wonder what was the sort of intended effect, because it made it, in some ways it kind of makes it a little bit more bearable. Like it makes the sort of the horror kind of it a little bit more sort of, it's flagged up that this is not kind of in the real world, because it's set in a city that's on the wrong river, kind of. And which it sort of actually kind of what it made me think of in a weird way was that scene in The Producers, where the Mel Brooks movie, where they've just visited the Nazi guy who wrote the play, what was it, Springtime in Germany?
Yes.
Springtime for Hitler. And and they come out, and he's given them these Nazi armbands, and then they come out and they just like throw it in the trash, and they just I forget the name of the character. The Gene Wilder's character just has this complete freak out about this, and it's sort of because you get this kind of like, like sort of hint that the author or the narrator thinks that this isn't kind of the way humans really are. That you're given a kind of a license to be like, to sort of almost it's to sort of to put up a little kind of wall between yourself as a reader and that section, while in other sections like in the in the sort of bits that are very squarely in sort of Tómas Jónsson's sort of mind and his sort of point of view, you don't have, there's no wall. You're just sort of sucked into this swamp of a mind.
That's interesting. And this is yeah. And then that section is offset weirdly, I guess, by the next one, which is 15, which the 15th book is simply 4 sentences. The soul is a man's wife. The soul is called Katrine. Katrine is my wife. Katrine means the pure, and that's it. And I'm personally not sure what to make out of that in comparison to these the parts that surround it either. Because the next page, 16 notebook, the first line is, "You are an adulteress, Katrine. You know no moderation in fornication." So it goes from this like Katrine is the pure, Katrine is the soul is a man's wife, to like you're an adulteress with no moderation, just bad.
And then that sentence actually sort of fits with actually what I was going to choose as my kind of favorite sentence in this chapter, because it's in let's see, it's earlier in the 14th notebook, page 322. It's there's this sentence, but fucking cannot be the goal of life, even if it might do some good in moderation.
I have that underlined too. It's a great. That's great.
Let's remember, this is a book that starts like, practically the first thing that happens in the book is like he's freaking out because he can hear, or thinks he can hear, that somebody's having sex in the same apartment as him, and he's just sort of obsessed by this idea.
It's true.
Yeah, and it's it's yeah, I think Tómas Jónsson would echo Walt Whitman in saying, I contradict myself very well. Right. I contradict myself.
Yeah,
and actually one of our guests on a previous podcast did notice that there's a section that I hadn't noticed when I was translating, which is a clear reference to 3 or 4 lines of Whitman. And so I don't know exactly how much Cuthberger knows what Whitman's work, but it would not surprise me if that was a real deliberate, thing that he had in his mind. I think Yeah, there's a moment, Whitman says, I think I could turn and live a while with the animals. They're so placid and self-contained. And there's a moment earlier in the book where it's like, I envy the animals. I could probably become one, live in their company. And of course, Thomas is living with his cat, and
which he might have just stole from the street.
Right, absolutely, right. His is a loose term in this book, I think. But the thing about this contradiction in it is, as again, sort of very weird as a translator to sort of think you've got a handle on something, and then suddenly you're like, oh, but the next sentence says the opposite of what I thought the previous one said. But I think that is that thing where, like, at times you maybe, you, as Kári was saying, you feel sympathy for this guy, and then he does something awful, and you're like, no, I feel no sympathy for him. And there's this kind of love-hate relationship with Iceland as an idea and country that I think is being called to mind every time we get those, like, the difference between sort of purity and sort of base fornication or something like that.
Yeah, that's very true. It's interesting to see how people react to this book, because there's usually that line among traditional readers, or I don't know people that I talk to that just generally are readers, who will say things like, I couldn't like relate to the characters. The character would, I didn't like any of the characters. And this is a book that really forces that on you, where it's like, you don't like him. At times you kind of do, and you maybe feel gross about that. And then at other times he's just, obviously you don't like him, and being in his mind is very disturbing or unsettling. And at the same time, a bit confused and not clear whether or not what he's telling you is what happened, or what he imagined happened, or what he feels guilty about, even though nothing happened. Everything's a muddle like that, and it makes it's like directly challenges that reading sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and I think that's sort of key to to being able to sort of give yourself over to the book as a reader, and sort of be taken along by it, and you're going to have to do a ton of work to keep up, and this is why it's so pleasing to hear that it, like the generation that was sort of reading when it was first came out was sort of really into it, because that's really exciting.
I have a question going back to that. So then it was reissued in 1987, and then more recently 2012, I think you said.
Yeah.
In those times, then the 1987 one, you said like it was for the people of that time, or that were Thomas Johnson's generation. What was the reaction among young readers when it was reissued? Do people still read the book with that same interest, or is it a totally different situation now and doesn't have those resonances? What is like the current reading climate of him in this book in particular in Iceland?
Well, I think let me first go back to my own youth as a sort of teen in the 90s. That at that point it was well known. Like, it was the kind of book. It had basically the sort of the capsule sort of description of it, the sort of virused its way through between people, was that it was about this sort of old man lying in bed and having sort of lurid fantasies about people, and that just in and of itself sort of appeals to kind of teenagers in a way, because it's so grotesque, and I remember quite a few of my sort of peers reading it when I was a kid, and I know that he like very recently there was a few years ago, I remember there was an article in a magazine or in a webzine, or sort of one of the sort of main kind of literary webzines in Iceland, where it was being talked about in relation to a Laxness novel, actually, the Under the Glacier, which actually they've been linked together they came out a year apart, I think, or 2 years apart, and they've been sort of linked together as this kind of new beginning of or new sort of direction in Icelandic novel writing, as a kind of reaction to the sort of French new novel and the sort of other kind of things that were happening in literature in Europe at the time.
That's really interesting too. So yeah, that I could see like that description being appealing to teenagers in particular. Old man laying in bed thinking about stuff that's kind of dirty sometimes. but much more complicated than that. I'm not even sure. Yeah, I'm not sure where else to go. Like, I'm not sure how to summarize 16 either, because this is one of like the series of sort of dates and letters in which he steals the cat, more or less. And that's weird, like very weird.
The kid yells when he sees him out the window. Something like, "There's a man stealing our cat and our garbage bin."
And I think all of this is like this sense of like, I think Thomas sees himself as this guy who has just got like caught up in things, like somehow he feels wronged by this kid's, and like he feels like the garbage bins are in his way, and you just sort of want to grab him by the shoulders and say, no, this is you doing this, right? And
you're causing your own problems.
Exactly. Yeah, but there is there is this whole thing about like agency. I mean, and the end of chapter 14 is about like, was I forced to do this rape, which I may or may not have done, and I think there is this theme going through the whole book, but it comes out particularly here of when you can sort of say, well, I didn't do anything, therefore I didn't do anything bad, as opposed to not acting being a form of being unethical.
Yeah, there's also in that scene, there's this sort of weird scene where Ólafur and Sigurður, his workmates, come for a visit.
Yeah,
and it sort of just sounds like for all the world, it like feels like he's being interrogated, but there's nothing. It's like a really sort of strange scene. It reminded me somehow of like that scene in the beginning of the trial by Kafka, where where like these two men just show up and kind of start kind of and start the sort of process of the trial, but it also kind of doesn't go anywhere. And there's something really weird going on.
Yeah,
in that sort of sense of feeling persecuted.
No problem. Even going back to that end of the 14th book, like that whole way that this plays out, like in terms of agency and in terms of like what happened, is both confusing and really interesting in that last paragraph. So it says, "And I'm relieved that someone made the decision for me, or semen was found in her, analyzed in the laboratory of the university. I ejaculated both on site and later in a dream, and also dreamed the event. I dreamed it long before. I ask, have you ever been forced to do another's will during sleep? No one forced you to rape or carry out the atrocities committed while you slept soundly and innocent." It's like kind of keeps going back and forth as like, what? Yeah. I mean, like there's ways in which it's like, I dreamed this a long time ago. It was a dream. I was sort of like forced into it. Where did that dream originate from? But then like that being, no one's forced you to do this while you're sleeping. Was he sleeping? I'm glad someone made the decision for me so that he's not the one that's in charge of it. Like there's a lot of that giving over and like a little confusion of like where these things get planted. And although not to tie it to the rape thing exactly, but there is a lot of stuff in this book in which there are like those ideas that because this has existed before, and this goes back to the idea of Iceland and the Icelandic heritage and being, the nation and like the origins of stuff, is that's sort of like implanted into you. Like that's there. That's part of the dream that he has no control over, because that's the time he can't control his thoughts. So given over to his like base Icelander heritage and ideas and everything that has been put into him, his dream is this rape. But he's just sleeping and he doesn't have any control over that. And how that then interacts in real life is really kind of at the crux of this book, where there are these like, that if you follow the nationalistic idea or the idea of like that you go back in time, you pay attention to like your history and like being good and honorable, but honorable in this very specific way that has a lot of these masculine traits that are not necessarily great, that it has a sense that it wants it to make that feel causal. Like that's what happens. You follow this line to the end, that's what happens. And you as the reader and as Tómas Jónsson are forced to like think outside of that and be like, well, does that have to be the case? Is there another way? And it becomes doubled, as we've said before, where it's not just him doing it, but then you as the reader having to determine where you are in relation to that same doubling. So you keep kind of having being put in those positions where you have to separate, like, is this the character? Is this character repeating shit? Because so much of this is repeating of other stories that he's mangling in some form, or just he's mangling them in a way that brings out this underlying basis that people don't even notice, because it's just part of the way that they deal with the world. Maybe.
Yeah.
No. Go on, Kári. Go on.
Oh, I was going to say that makes sense, and also it kind of fits. It's sort of the like he's like there's this whole thing, like, because he's so obsessed with procreation, and purity, and so it's kind of this kind of these things sort of link together, and there are all these sort of little beats that kind of keep returning through the whole book, which are really odd until you sort of start thinking about it from that part. Like, to give one example, and this is kind of I guess sort of almost sort of comes at an angle to what you were saying, Chad, is that there's he mentions on numerous occasions through the book. He mentions a real woman, a real Icelandic woman, Oddný Sen, and she actually features at the beginning of 14th composition book, where which is who's very famous in Iceland, and she is an Icelandic woman who moved to China. I'm not sure exactly of the story, but she moved to China and married a Chinese man. That's why she has the last name Sen.
Oh, okay.
And it's sort of and he actually sort of treats her very, very, like, he clearly has, Tómas Jónsson clearly has respect for her. Like, when he's imagining himself into her mind I don't remember exactly, but it's somewhere in the sort of opening of, or the early pages of the 14th composition book, he's very sort of respectful of her, because she's kind of a woman of the world, kind of,
Right.
and but then when you think, okay, so she's married to someone who's not Icelandic, and he kind of gets so obsessed with her is sort of part of this kind of, bizarre kind of purity, sort of, like the sort of thing where he starts defending fascism somewhere in book 14, if I remember correctly, where he's this kind of like violence and sort of purity, and this kind of thing that he calls a sort of I think a defense of beauty or something, or sort of a search for beauty, and it becomes this sort of festering, sort of horrible, sort of kind of motor inside his body that sort of drives sort of his character kind of off the sort of cliff almost.
Yeah. Well, I think this is where the 16th notebook comes in, because amid all of this, some of the stuff that happens in the 16th notebook, which has it seems like a notebook, it has these sort of little letters, and events seem to sort of not fit with one another. But there's this scene where he seems to be the father, biological or otherwise, of a child who's in Katrine's womb. And he has this real love-hate relationship with it, where, he's sort of trying to advise it to stay in the womb because the world sucks and you shouldn't come out.
Right.
Which obviously not good. But these little tender little moments where, things like, I put my ear to her paunch, little tambourine. And for just that brief moment, you're like, you see the capacity in him for some kind of engagement. And then he continues on and listen to the forthright demands of this nucleated child. And you're like, man, this child hasn't even been born and you're already pissed at him.
Oh, man. Yeah, you're right. That does kind of put a good kind of counter to the 14th one. And there's so many. Okay, so I know we need to wrap up here. So maybe, I know, Kári, said your favorite line. I don't know if you have another one that you want to add to it, but I had an alternate. Okay, go for it.
It's on page 334. It's in the middle of that sort of weird section where Tómas is trying to sort of imagine they're telling this weird story, which is pieced together from newspaper reports about this. What's it, Admatova? woman who stays in the Admatova Antonova, the woman who stays in the tomb of Lenin and becomes this kind of hero, Russian or like a Soviet hero. But it's this bit where he's talking about the sort of political sort of when the sort of terror, the Stalinist terror of the 30s, and he's so kind of obsessed with his own mind that he turns it into the sort of Stalinist terror into a way to sort of solving housing congestion, because he's so obsessed with that there's so many people in his apartment.
Yeah.
And let me see if I can. Oh yeah, here it is. And so he says, talking about the Stalinist terror, but to prevent housing congestion, the government sent the police at night to disappear people without a trace. and it's sort of like I love the way he has in this book. Guðbergur has a way of like not only sort of writing these striking sentences, but these striking sentences which also sort of just give you a sort of like somehow could only come from the mind of this or the mouth of this one particular very sort of singular character.
Yeah, it's fair. I like that part too. I had the line right before there underlined too of like that's 20 years of the USSR had this one effect, making people themselves quasi animals.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's that sense where, like, you do get that sense, we are not meant to be agreeing with Guðberg's creation, but with the kind of the ways of like he's critiquing thought. My line comes on page 351, and it fits in with this. It's a sentence whose idea and argument I hate, but the sort of bold statement of it is pretty masterful, and it seems like there's a lot of people in America right now who believe this, which is page 351. I long to return to the chivalric era when splendid men pillaged splendid women and rode fast horses. And I just feel like that's like, make America great again, sort of summed up in a nutshell. So,
yeah.
Like that, yeah.
Building on that, I had a few in mind, but this one maybe fits in best with that, is from 326. Instead, people should write best-selling books about good and healthy people. Write best-selling books about me, Tómas Jónsson.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Don't leave it to me alone to make myself famous and wealthy. It's just perfect. So, anyways, well, thank you guys very much. And next week we'll be back with the final episode, which is recorded live at the Taste of Iceland at Spoonbill and Sugartown this past weekend. Other than that,
we need a quick hello to Jason Isaacs as we leave. But other than that, I think we'll see everybody next week.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hello to Jason Isaacs and all members of Pentangle and that may be listening. Report convention, yes.
Sure. See you next week.
Kári, is there anything that you want to say about like where people can find you online? Or I'll link to your article or the excerpt from your book that's available in English. But if are you on Twitter or any of those places?
I mean, I am on Twitter but I'm not very. I was an early adopter and an early sort of lever of Twitter.
Solid.
But you can find me. It's KATTULLUS. But I think probably the place where I'm most active online is weirdly Metafilter. If you have people here who are Mephites, that's kind of that's sort of the sort of very very old, very small social sort of community weblog.
Absolutely,
the tag. Yeah.
Right on. Well, we'll link to all the stuff in the Grapevine articles. And thank you again for doing this. It was really fantastic talking to you.
Well, thanks for having me. It was great. And thanks for publishing the book and translating the book. It's always nice for Icelanders when a sort of important piece of Icelandic culture sort of makes it out into the world.
Yeah, I'm glad that we were able to find this book and bring it out. It's so fantastic. So, and thank you, Lytton, for doing such a great job again.
Well, it's sort of great that Open Letter is actually prepared to take a chance on these things, which are sort of like mad and difficult, but essential and a lot of fun.
And as a final thing, I'm surprised I managed to keep it away from this because of the Iceland thing. But I was just in Catalonia, which is having its independence vote, and has some of the things from Tómas Jónsson don't directly show up in there. But there's that sense when I was there of this weird. We have this idea of who we are as our own country. Do we want to be our own country, and what does that mean in relationship to the surrounding environment? So it's pretty interesting to be reading this book in contrast to that moment. But maybe we'll talk about that some other time or not. Anyways, thanks everyone for listening. Leave us a review on iTunes, and we'll be back next week with the end of Tómas Jónsson Bestseller.